great. Here comes some more. Yeah, so I'm Barton. I live just over in Vermont, in western Hot Springs County, on Owl Creek. So since there's not very many people here, I'd kind of like to know names or kind of where you're from at least. Yeah, is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Ty Fife. I'm from here in Edmonton.
Okay, Ty. Okay. What kind of, do you have an operation going or something?
No, not
Okay.
right now.
Okay.
I've raised, a little bit of beef in the past, not a whole lot, and yeah, I don't have any.
Okay. Yeah. How about you?
I'm Rex. I'm from just a little north of Powell, and just getting started with a small homestead. We have some chickens, some miniature painting goats, and we'll have some yaks and hopefully some cows.
Okay. What kind of ghost did you say?
Miniature fainting.
Miniature
goats.
fainting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
I'm Kelly. We're here from FSA. But
Oh,
I'm from
you're good.
Portland.
Orlando. Okay.
And I'm married.
Married.
I'm in the Rivers and for FSA.
Okay. Yeah. Steph?
Yep. Yep, I live here in Riverton,
Okay.
and we actually have boys part-time up in Du Bois as well.
Mhm.
So our long-term goal is to be up there, but,
And is there some livestock or crop
yeah,
production there?
so, I mean, just kind of family land a long time ago, my grandpa had grazing and tons of cows up there.
Okay.
And now my dad he likes to just keep some cows on there just for, people and agriculture
Sure.
and horses.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Great.
My name is Lindsay Washkoviak. I run Esquivel Creamery. It's the only goat dairy and creamery in the state of Wyoming.
Okay.
Grade A goat dairy creamery.
And where is it?
Saratoga, Wyoming.
Okay. Hi, Danica.
Hi,
Where are you from?
I'm Danica. I'm out of Casper, Wyoming. I have not started the homestead yet, but I do at least have 40 acres I'm trying to plan for to mitigate the number of disastrous mistakes I will make.
Okay. I'm Barton. Barton, yeah. Hi.
Hi. I'm Carrie Hacking. I live in Casper, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but we just got 12 acres in October, and we have goats and poultry.
Okay.
Hey, we can work together.
Hi, how are you? We're just kind of introducing ourselves since there's not very many people. My name is Bart Stam. I'm with EW Extension, and you're the last one that walked in, so it's your turn to say your name.
Oh, gosh, I totally missed that. I work with ag producers on the Wind River Reservation
Okay.
and just gathering information.
Okay, great.
They're all out there busy,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah, everyone's busy this winter with with whatever this winter's been. So, well, as I said, my name's Barton. So I've been a range management educator with the University of Wyoming since 2004, and I will just say that this symposium or conference is geared to maybe a slightly different clientele than I normally work with. So I very much have a bias, or at least maybe my work experience is very much more with traditional ag producers. So mostly cattle and sheep operations would be my forte, or what I work with most. So there'll be a slight slant that direction, but I'm hoping that a lot of the principles that we'll go over would be at least applicable to maybe some non-traditional or some smaller operations as well. And I definitely do work with a lot of small acreage owners as well, people that have everything from just a few horses to some smaller animals as well. Hopefully, in this small kind of classroom and with not a ton of people here, that if we can just kind of have a conversation and talk about some things. So if you have questions or comments as we're going along, please just raise your hand or just say, hey. If you have arguments or whatever, just keep those to yourself. So, what's your name?
Mason.
Mason?
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
we all went around and said who we were and where we were from. So.
My name is Mason Rivera. I'm from Casper.
Okay,
So,
great to have you here, Mason.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to get started here. I tend to walk around a lot. It doesn't look like there's a remote, so we can handle that. So we're going to talk, these are the sort of the things we're going to talk about, and I sort of admitted my definite bias or experience being with cattle and sheep producers, but I think that things are going to go along fairly well for most of you. And I also approached this presentation in this way. The title is to reduce feed costs. And the slant that I had about reducing feed costs is to maximize the health and production of our pastures to graze. So that's kind of the slant that I'm gonna be on here. So if that wasn't what you were looking for and you run out of here, I won't hold it too much against you. But anyway, when I look at this slide here, and it kind of looks like a grain or whatever, but just kind of think of this as a grass plant, okay? That's going through different stages of production. All the way from barely coming out of the ground to a mature plant here with seeds that are ready to fall out and hit the ground. And I want to start out with a question. I have on there frequency, intensity, and timing, though. Someone explain to me what I mean by frequency, intensity, and timing when we're talking about grazing.
How long you let them graze and what location and how often you move them.
Okay, yeah, thank you. What about intensity?
How many head do you have?
Okay, yeah, how many head? And then there's a little bit more to it with intensity that I want to get. And I sometimes call that, a lot of times it's called utilization. So how many head you have definitely impacts it. How many head you have grazing a particular area of size. So, I mean, we could have 1,000 head of sheep on 10,000 acres, or we could have 1,000 head of sheep on 100 acres, right? And then also with intensity or utilization, it's how much of that plant are we taking, are we harvesting, okay? And then timing, what I want to get at with timing is where in this growth cycle, from here all the way over, are we actually doing the grazing? Is that utilization taking place? And I want to kind of highlight the importance of that by asking this question. If you were that grass plant, so you're no longer the ag producer, all right? We're not the rancher, not having the creamery, you are the grass plant. Where on that scale would you least want to be grazed? And then be prepared to defend your answer.
Really on that, probably that tillering, like that first portion and maybe even into that second portion a little bit.
Okay, so I'm just gonna say it so that we all know what you're talking about. Are you right in here?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I'm gonna say heading, because you've already put all your energy into producing seeds, but you didn't quite get there.
So are you thinking in here?
Yeah.
Okay. What else? And I will maybe make the stipulation that I think it's possible to overgraze any time of the year. But if you were the grass plant, that's the question, where would you least want to be grazed? Okay, so Lindsay, you kind of defended your answer a little bit with, you wanted to put in here because you put energy in, but then you would graze.
If I was an animal, I would want to eat it there. If
Yeah.
I was the grass, I wouldn't,
Okay, but if you were the animal, why would you want to eat it then?
because it has most nutrient dense, well, probably the kernel stage would have the most nutrient dense from a grain perspective.
Okay, okay. And then you said through here, right? Why did you say in through there? I didn't
Well, you
hear
really haven't even had time to I guess defend yourself as being a
Yeah.
grass, right?
Okay.
Like you haven't even matured
Okay,
to be able to, I think, be healthy and continue to be productive.
okay, all right. Any other thoughts or questions about this?
I would also
Yeah,
say
Rex.
the tillering, just because you haven't been able to develop enough roots, so like you're more likely to not be able to recover.
Okay.
Not recover quickly if it's, in that earlier part.
So you're down in here too, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, I will say that both those answers really kind of hit on some very critical points of our grass growth cycle. Before I kind of give you my synopsis of it, let me ask you another question. What is driving this cycle? Like, there's a lot of winners, right, that you can go out right now and see this time of year, right? How about this winter? No. But so what is driving this cycle to get this started? Because we're not even there yet this year. What drives this cycle to go from here all the way to here? What are the things that's driving that cycle? Heat, soil temperature. Okay, I'm going to call those the same thing, but that's exactly right. Heat and soil temperature. Yeah. Moisture. Okay. Yeah, those are the big drivers of what's doing that. Now, can you guys remember just a horrible year in terms of drought? Okay? The last couple of years haven't necessarily been the greatest, but for me, I look back at like 2012 was a horrible year. Does anyone else have a year that was just horrible for them, or drought that you remember?
Years like late 90s.
Okay, yeah. The early 2000s had some pretty bad, a lot of years had bad drought, right? So in those really bad years, this cycle lasts about a half an hour, right? In years where what this year might be shaped, well, we'll see. We could get real hot real fast. It doesn't appear to be that way. But in this year, we could have a really late spring. If we stay cool, so if you pay attention to Dawn Day and the La Nina is fading out, and we're switching more to that El Nino sort of thing. I think I get that right, but I'll have to go back and watch the Dawn Day forecast again. But we may be going to our cooler, wetter trend, okay? And so this process, this spring, not only could start later, because like we said, a lot of years you can find cheatgrass right now that was green. I don't even think the cheatgrass is green anywhere yet. So this is gonna start later in the year, and there are some of those years where it seems like we get to almost July before, and of course this is gonna vary from, say 4,500, 5,000 feet elevation down here. There's a huge amount of variance between when this happens on the calendar for those types of elevations versus 8, 9, 10,000 feet. So there is that. So it's really the soil temperature and the precip that's driving this. So the soil has to get warm enough. And then what keeps a plant, so we have these long springs and we have these short springs. What keeps these grass plants in this stage longer than in those bad years where we're dry and hot? It's really the heat, right? The soil staying cool. And then as the temperatures rise and the soil profile dries out, the plant is thinking it wants to do the one goal of, its one biological goal is to what?
Reproduce.
Reproduce, absolutely. And there's a lot of reproduction that happens vegetatively, not just with seeds. So with grass plants, especially in our area, that would be tillering, so additional of these stems with a root, and then also with rhizomatous grasses. We don't have, there's also another grass called stoloniferous. We don't have a lot of those around here, but the rhizomes are actually underground horizontal stems that would appear very much look like a root. And so that's a way to reproduce as well as the seed. So as we move through this cycle, it's the heat and the temperature, and for the grass to get to this stage, the heat is going to be what, relatively? High. And the soil moisture is going to be what? Relatively low, okay? So, the answers that we gave about when would you not want to be grazed are both exactly right. I would probably lean a little bit more this way, is going to be, in these stages, would be the time period where if you're grazing, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be grazing, but if you are grazing during these time periods, where you really have to be on your game. Like, this is the time to be doing the best management you have.
So is that the time to graze?
Well,
Or
it could
not to
be. It could be, but it really depends, okay? So, it all depends on your operation. Most of the big livestock operations I work with have almost no choice. They really have to be grazing at some point throughout the cycle. Does that mean that every pasture has to be grazed throughout the cycle? Hopefully not. On smaller type acreages, and I'll get to this a little later, but when I'm working with someone who's a small acreage type person, especially where it's not a big part of their income, and we really have, or it's actually a cost for them, and we really have a lot of flexibility, I'll tell people not to graze at all in this stage. For most people that are trying to make a living though, from their land, at least some years, they are going to be grazing in this stage. But this is where we really are gonna, our timing is probably not the best according to the grass plan. So we really need to watch our frequency and our intensity of how much we're grazing. So there's the old rule about take half, leave half. Like that was a rule, that's a rule of thumb in range management from 100 years ago. I would suggest to you that take half, leave half is not really that great of a rule of thumb. Because in this stage, every year, I think take half, leave half is too much. Clear out here to the right, I think take half, leave half is leaving too much on the table probably. Okay? And back out here, take half, leave half is really almost not even possible. Clear down in these stages, right? Now I don't want to ignore the grazing situation down here because we had a couple answers there and they're good ones because you can do some damage here. The one advantage we have when we're down here in this stage, if our management is good, okay, is that the soil temperatures are still relatively cool and the soil moisture is still relatively high. So getting on grasses in these stages, if your management is good and you're willing to do some things like rotational graze or just flat out remove animals, it is possible to get some use here and then get off and then get some regrowth. When we get further into this stage, especially if we're on an irrigated property where we can really prolong the soil moisture, keeping grasses in this stage while you're grazing, so you're on, you're grazing, you're off, you're irrigating, or maybe it's raining, and you're getting some regrowth, that's where you can really maximize your production, okay? And then anytime when we're in an irrigated situation, our flexibility, our leeway, and our ability to be the best manager possible really goes up, okay? In a dryland situation, or like a rangeland situation, when we're here and we're thinking about grazing every year in that spot, that's where we can really do a little bit of damage. And the answer Lindsay gave about the plant has invested all its time and energy, but then it doesn't quite get to reproduce is exactly right. And then the other problem with doing some heavy grazing here in the same spot every year during this time of growth is that soil temperatures are relatively high, soil moisture is relatively low, and so the opportunity for regrowth is relatively low. Now, if we're talking about a warm season plant, so we don't have a lot of warm season grasses, there are some in Wyoming, but they're not usually a big part of our ag production. But let's say we're talking about not a grass, but we're talking about alfalfa, right? Well, there's not very many people that are grazing alfalfa, but it can be done. But if you're in hay production, we want that heat, and the heat of the summer to grow along with irrigation to do your production. Grasses really shut down though once the temperature gets hot, the cool season grasses. If you get out to places like the Midwest, sort of eastern Wyoming, but like especially in Kansas, Nebraska, and then even further into further east, they have the warm season grasses that really thrive in those hot weather. That is not our situation here. So we do have blue grandma and one or two other warm season species of grasses in Wyoming, but mostly it's going to be these cool season grasses. They're going to follow very similar trends. There are going to be, of course, we mentioned the differences in elevation, even aspects, so south or north facing. And then certain grasses are going to do this slower than others, even in cool season. So the first one that's going to be doing this right down here is going to be like cheatgrass, right? That's why we call it cheatgrass. It's a winter annual. It's going to come up, one of the first things to come up and get going. And then some of those longer ones that stay, they're going to take a little bit longer to get going. So things like western wheatgrass or thick spike are going to still be cool season, but just a little bit shifted into the year. Any questions or discussion about what we've gone over so far on this slide? Or even disagreements, let's have it. Okay, so that's that was kind of a long slide. One of my colleagues and friends who's seen me talk about this slide a lot is always making fun of me for spending so much time on this slide. But those principles that I hope that we talked about are really going to sort of place the foundation for how we can think in terms of our grazing management and how we're gonna go forward through there to use those resources in a profitable, but also in a sustainable fashion.
What if you've been, what if there's been a long time where there's nothing been grazing on an area and it really hasn't been, I guess, eaten down? And I guess it's already high.
Mhm.
What do you do with that?
The plants are high?
Mhm.
Yeah. So in that case, you may have some decadent vegetation there. And we actually see this quite a bit because even on a rangeland environment that has been grazed, you'll see it in sites where the animals don't want to go. So it might be a steep slope, it might be far from water, there might be other reasons. And so you'll see plants that have multiple years of growth around them. Animals aren't going to want to eat that, the old growth. And so what we need to do as managers then is reduce their ability to be selective. And so that usually means doing things like increasing their desire to be in that area. So in a large rangeland pasture, I might put a supplement in that area. On a smaller type environment, I might fence them in to where they have no choice. And like I think what Mary was talking about earlier when she talked about so many animals in in the same spot, is putting a high amount of animals density relative to the area they're in. So like you said, you had 12 acres.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what you've got there, but let's say you took your 12 acres and you divided it up into half-acre lots,
Mhm.
and you put 20 sheep
Sure.
or 20 yearling steers. Well, their ability to be selective is much reduced compared to if you had 2 steers on your whole 12 acres. So that's going to be a good way to start cleaning up those decadent, or what you call them, coarse or wolfy plants.
Mm-hmm.
But removing their ability to be selective is going to be important there. The other thing that goes on with that question is the type of animal that you're grazing with. So you can get a lot more, so an old cow, she might be a little bit less, or has the ability to be less selective than say a goat or a sheep that has very fine mouth parts that can really just get in there and grab the one leaf blade that they want, right? So a cow has a little bit harder time than a goat or a sheep. You just look at their mouths or their lips and you can see why. And then you get down to some, to poultry or something, and that's a whole different world. So those are the kind of things that you're going to be looking at with managing for those old decadent plants. And that happens not just on a smaller type property, but it happens all over. Like I've worked with, you can look in places where you take the livestock off and you want to make it like an elk wintering ground. Well, as soon as you take the livestock off, a lot of times the elk go to where the cattle have been. Maybe they're not there now, but they want to go to where there's been active grazing because regrowth. And that's actually fallen right in well with this slide here that I have up now. They want that regrowth. And so doing some active grazing can actually be very healthy for some of those places. So like this picture that I've got up, wasn't the intent that I had when I brought this up, but it goes very well with that question. Is we have this, so someone tell me what time of year I probably took this picture.
Looks like spring.
Okay, looks like spring.
I'd say fall because of the taller grass.
It's fall. Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you remember the previous slide we had, let me go back to it just for a second. I guess I think I can go back. So this, on a normal year in Wyoming, say 5,000 to 6,000 feet, when during the calendar does this happen? Right here.
Late summer, August-ish.
Okay.
If the stickers in my boot are any
All right.
indication.
Okay. I'm gonna back you up a little bit and say that you're gonna get, and it kind of depends on your interpretation of the grass plant here and how dry it is, but the seeds on a lot of our plants are gonna be ready to go, late June, July sometime, right? And the higher elevation, you're absolutely right, or how moist it is, you're absolutely right. So now when we get to this stage, and remember we talked about when we were back here, we talked about when would you least want to be grazed. And so we were really kind of talking about, let's say for this year, late March, early April to summer sometime, mid to late summer, okay? We kind of left out the rest of the year. So this time of year right here, this is fall regrowth, okay? And this doesn't happen every year, okay? So to get this fall regrowth, for one, certain species do it better than others. This happens to be crested wheatgrass, which is one that does fall regrowth really well, okay? And then we also got late summer or early fall rain, so some moisture in the season. You could do the same thing with irrigation if you had it, okay? This is another time where you as forage managers need to up your management game just a little bit, okay? Because what's this plant doing now? Is it so concerned about, I realize I'm putting a lot of human attributes on these plants, but I'm a simple man. What's this plant really worried about right now in early September? Reproduction?
Vegetative growth to build energy for next year.
Yeah, we're really talking about building the root base, right? The perennial part of the plant is the part of the plant that we never look at, the roots, right? We call these perennial grasses. We never look at the perennial part. All this stuff above ground is not perennial. So really it's looking at building up some carbohydrate reserves to survive the winter. This kind of, if you were a sheep or a cow or a horse, how would you view this plant right now?
That's the tasty bit.
That's the tasty stuff, right? And are you gonna be eating this stuff? Not if you can help it. It's all gonna be down here.
If you're a goat sometimes.
Yeah. Well, that's a great comment about, that really brings out the differences in grazing characteristics between the different species. Yeah, thank you. So, and if there was a cottonwood branch had fallen in here and some leaves on it, the goats would be even happier, right? Mm-hmm. So, this is a time of year where we really need to watch our grazing management as well. And if you look at a grass growth graph, like a line graph, you'll see, that big bump in the spring, then it goes down through the heat of the summer, and then you'll see a little blip again in the early fall. That's where we're thinking right here. So this is another good time to up your management. Now, that brings up some good points. What else is going on in this photo that you see that you like as a forage manager?
All the stuff on the ground creating a natural mulch.
Okay, thank you. That's exactly what I was going for. Yeah, so some people might call this wasted feed. That's fine. But what is this stuff laying down on the ground, and even the stuff that's still up that's probably going to lay down from trampling or snow? What's all that going to do for us?
Keep the soil warm and wet.
Okay? Yep, it's going to introduce organic matter. It's a slow process, right? This is obviously not a real high producing site, but this is really going to improve our soil management. It's going to increase our soil cover, reduce potential for wind and water erosion, and then increase our potential for holding water in the soil profile, so that when it rains or when we irrigate, those water events are more effective for us. So when I said earlier that, when we get clear out here and beyond, and I think that if you're only grazing 50-50, you're probably leaving stuff on the table. It's because from an individual plant's perspective, you have a lot more leeway in the terms of how much grass you're growing. So we get clear out to October, November, December. You can do a lot of grazing on a lot of species and not do that much, and not do hardly any damage to the plant long term. But it does take away some of this adding organic matter to the soil. So those are some important things to consider when we're talking about maximizing your pastures. And don't just think about the parts of the plant that you're seeing, but really consider not just the perennial parts of the plant, the roots, but also the soil that the roots are growing in, and how you can maximize the soil's potential to grow things. Questions there? Okay. All right, so as I said, I'm going to look over just a couple of strategies here. I work with a lot of small acreage owners as well. So when people start talking about how to manage those properties, this kind of an operation is the most common one that I see. but it's probably the least effective as well. So a season-long grazing strategy where it's just one perimeter fence, the animals are out there the entire year, and there's no management, right? And a lot of times, you'll also see like a hay bale out here, or a round bale feeder, or something else. And so they eat all they want on the hay bale, and then they go out and eat all the grass. And also what typically happens is, especially, you know, a winter like this where you might be feeding hay all winter long, and then the second there's any little bit of green, they're not only eating the hay, they're also eating the grass. Then as we move longer into the season, all the grass is eaten, so we continue to feed hay, okay? So even on small scales or big scales, this is not a strategy that I really want to look at too much. So what are some alternate strategies? Okay, so I really want to limit access during certain times of the year. I want to try rotational grazing, and let's get it strip grazing too. So when I talk about limit access, you know, clear back to where we were talking about where would you least want to be grazed to have long-term forage production. And I mentioned this a little bit as a strategy already, but when I'm working with that person, especially a small acreage owner, someone who has horses that's not a financial interest in them, doesn't work as well with animals that are, you know, for meat or milk production, because there's a little bit of other things going on with their nutrition. But this works really well with horses to limit their access. Lock them up during those critical times of the year and don't let them eat it, okay? It's a simple one. It's not the answer for everyone, so don't get me wrong here. It works very well for some people though. Instead of feeding hay all winter long and then let them have free access the rest of the year, lock them up in the spring and feed hay in the spring, okay? It's a little bit alternate. This year it didn't work so well because even if you had a lot of grass, there was so much snow out there that it didn't work as well. But it's a nice strategy, especially with horses. Lock them up in the spring, feed them hay in the spring, let them graze the rest of the year. So we're talking about a lot of dormant season grazing, and we'll get to that in a little bit as far as nutritional requirements. But I mean, when you look at the horses that are out there, 99 of them are too fat compared to the one that's too skinny. So horses can do very well on a dormant season grazing. This is a picture of two different properties where one is getting season-long grazing and one's getting mostly limited access, okay? So there's a fence line, you know. The other interesting part about this picture is, can you see what's going on?
They're eating over the fence.
Yeah. So there's horses over on this property that are sticking their heads over trying to eat this grass. Yeah. So, I mean, there's other things that can go on there as well, but. Okay, so this is an example of strip grazing, and this is obviously a cattle ranch in the Bighorn Basin that's going on. This ranch is a long-term traditional, a long-term cattle ranch, been in the family for a long time. But it's really being managed by maybe the younger generation. So I don't know exactly, but I'm sure they're probably in their 30s. And there were some family disputes about how we're going to change up management. And they started, instead of just throwing the animals out there and letting them have full access, these cattle are old, and this field is mostly smooth brome. I think I took this picture in February, March, I think. Not this year. And smooth brome really isn't that great of a grass as far as, I mean, it is a wonderful grass, but as far as wintertime nutrition, all grasses are low. Smooth brome is one of the worst, right? But what they're doing is with one little electric fence, one wire, and on a spool, they're giving them a strip at a time, okay? And they also have access up here. So like what you were talking about, is there old stuff to graze?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is old, I mean, it's only 1 year old, but this is old stuff, and smooth brome is kind of nasty when it's even 1 year old. And they're doing a great job with it. And there's also some supplementing concerns going on here because these cows are obviously going to be calving here. And that's a consideration, because their nutrient requirements are going to be going up. But this way, these producers are able to increase the efficiency of their pastures, reduce the amount of hay they're feeding, so we're reducing feed costs. Not only in terms of the actual cost of the hay, but in terms of running the equipment, fuel and all that. And then using it more efficiently, and then they're also not haying it all winter too. So there's some more savings. They've also, in this scenario, kind of right behind me where I'm taking this picture, there's a creek bottom, typical kind of creek bottom for Wyoming with cottonwoods and some perennial water going through there. They fenced off the creek bottom as part of this, and they've increased the survivability of a lot of their calves. Because those cows a lot of times would go down into the creek bottom to calve, and then every once in a while you get one in the creek or in a snowbank. And so that's been sort of a side benefit, but I mean, that's a big benefit, right? Have more calves or more lambs that are alive. I mean, that's the whole point of it. So that was a benefit that I'm not sure they realized when they implemented this, but it didn't take them very long at all to actually see that benefit. So what's the difference between this, which I'm calling strip grazing, and what would a lot of times we call rotational grazing? Because they're not putting a back fence here. So if we're in another time of year, say springtime, where we're worried about grazing at that time of year where right before seed set or seed formation, like called the boot stage. If we were going to be doing some rotational grazing, we'd want to have another electric fence behind the cows, right? In this scenario though, there's not any regrowth going on. I mean, this is February, January. I mean, they're doing this probably from the first of the year. There's no regrowth going on. So we're not really concerned with regrowth being fenced off in this scenario. And what that allows you to do is make it real easy to have a one source of water, maybe one source of mineral. Because when you're doing a rotational graze, you still have to worry about where the animals are going to water, where they might get nutrient or like mineral. In this scenario, there's no back fence. They can go right clear back to the water because we're not worried about regrowth. The cows are automatically gonna do this, and these cattle get trained to this. And sheep, like I said, I've worked with some of the other species, but cattle and sheep are definitely my bias, and of course horses. But they just totally learn what's going on here, really, really fast. And it's a really nice system for these folks. I'm not saying that any of these scenarios are likely to be the exact scenario for anyone in this room. But what I'm hoping is that some of these ideas will help you use them as a tool to customize it for your operations. Okay, so these are some dirt clods that I dug up. This is one of my all-time favorite pictures. I'm such a nerd. So this was a cattle operation that wanted, different from the one just now from the strip grazing, still in the Bighorn Basin, where this operation, guy was getting older, very traditional cattle production. He's at least in his 70s, if not 80s. So I mean, we're talking traditional, very sort of, rancher, cowboy, Wyoming guy, right? But he wanted to do less haying, be less dependent on harvested feeds, reduce feed costs, but also for him, it was just like he didn't want to do it anymore in the summer, and he didn't want to do feed as much in the wintertime. So he went to more of a rotational grazing time, but on part of his field, he was still going to raise some hay, okay? These two dirt clods were separated by nothing but an electric fence. And one side gets rotational grazed, and one side gets hayed. You tell me which is which.
The left is grazed.
The left is rotational grazed. Tell me how many years that took. This is 1 year. Now this is an irrigated pasture, all right? And I didn't go out and dig 100 different samples. I wasn't gonna do that in the poor guy's field, right? So it's maybe not the best scientific test. And actually, if you know Caitlin Youngquist, who was one of the organizers of this event, she's the soils guru too, and we were both there when we dug that up. And this is one of my coolest pictures that I've ever done. So, we're talking about organic matter, the perennial part of the plant, like this soil profile has it going on, right? That's what you're looking for.
Is that more compacted because the cattle were like standing on it?
Well,
Way so much?
I would say no, that this side probably had more cattle in it,
Okay.
more times of the year. But in this side, there was more opportunity for growth and regrowth and also watering. Because in a haying situation, like it's gonna get irrigated, we're gonna shut the irrigation off, we're gonna hay it once, there's no growth and regrowth and intermixing, I mean, of course if it rains, but we're not gonna be irrigating this during haying season. Where this side really, had multiple irrigation events, it had multiple grazing events. The important part here is that it had multiple rest events during the springtime. So those plants were really just able to pile in the roots. Really some pretty cool stuff there. Yeah. Okay, I've kind of put those photos in backwards. This is another property. I'm gonna show you the same property here in a second, but on different owners, okay? So this is a pasture, it's got horses grazing, some cottonwoods. There are a few young cottonwoods that this stuff is, but this is mostly like lamb's quarter weeds growing. Well, sorry, I apologize.
Weed's a matter of definition.
Yeah.
Or weed's a matter of opinion.
Yeah. I told you my bias, right? So, yeah, less desirable perennial or annual forest. So that's what was going on here. These horses, I mean, I know there's a fence here, but they had full access to this property. Okay. Now remember the color of the horses. Okay. Same property, almost the exact same spot. The horse's color is different, right? So this is a new property owner. Okay. And this is also taken in the fall, early fall, fairly obvious. This was 2 years difference of, well, let me back up, more like 1.5 years difference in the time this photo was taken. So the last one was taken in early spring. This photo was taken in early to mid fall of the following year of locking them up, limiting access, okay? So when we go to, from this, what do you see? Like, what are the horses eating? Yeah, like this type. Now, if we put goats or even sheep in here, this would be a whole different story. So that's why, I mean, this property would actually do even better if the owner wanted to put some goats or sheep on there, because there's still some of those plants the horses aren't going to want to eat. That brings up a good point that doing a multi-species grazing is a wonderful tool to use in many pastures. Not only do you get the benefit of different animals, and that could be like horses, obviously in this country at least aren't used for meat that much, but you might use them for pleasure, for work, for hunting, whatever. But say this was cattle, and we could have beef production, but then we could also have goats and sheep on there and have lamb and wool production. We could have, the creamery, a goat dairy, right? So there's all kinds of options that we could have. Not only do you have that benefit of multiple products with multi-species grazing, but they're going to be grazing differently. So if you threw some goats or even sheep out there, this process could have gone even faster. In this case, this property owner was really looking at grass for the horses, obviously. And so all that was basically two springs of totally limiting the access to this part of the pasture during that spring growth, and then doing dormancies and grazing the rest of the year. And that this is a riparian area. It's not irrigated unless the creek floods. So there are some advantages there where like there's deeper soil, that kind of a stuff. But this is more of a kind of a wild, I would guess, or I would say pasture than it's not a high producing field. It's not being irrigated. It's not being fertilized. That kind of stuff. Okay, questions about that?
So basically,
Yeah.
it was one season of rest from a spring perspective. The grasses were able to outcompete the lamb's quarters and the annual weeds.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Now, let me say that the grass species there was no seeding done either. So let me say that the grass species were obviously still there in terms of their roots were there. you can get to the point in the pasture where you just totally abuse it, that we do have to do some actual rehab or reclamation work, seeding, those kind of things. But yeah, in basically one season of rest, this is what happened. And there was no chemical, there was no spraying here either. No fertilizing, no chemical. Grazing management did this. That is not gonna be the case everywhere. Like if this had been, if instead of lamb's quarter that had been knapweed, that wouldn't have happened that fast. Or if this had been a south-facing slope, that probably wouldn't have happened that fast. But even in those scenarios, we could start adjusting the management too, into different ways, through different ways. Okay, so when we're talking about grass production, it's really one of the things that people, not just grass, that's maybe a poor title for this slide, but forage production or browse production. People really want to know, how much am I going to have? People really look at this clip and weigh thing. Who has done clip and weigh? When I talk about grass production and measuring how much grass you have, who's done clipping and weighing? Have you ever done it like totally on your own?
My previous life, I was a botanist.
Okay.
So,
right.
I haven't done it for pasture management actually, but I've done it for work a lot.
Okay.
To evaluate grazing.
So when I ask ranchers if they've done clip and weigh, and then a lot of them will raise their hands too, and then I'll like, okay, which of you have done it when there was no university person there, no NRCS person there, no conservation district person there, or you weren't a grad student at a university? Like nobody raises their hand. Like people do not do this. I mean, nerds in grad study do, and I can say that because I was one of them. We do that kind of thing. Livestock producers aren't going to do it. I mean, some of them maybe, but it happens rare. Now, who does clip and weigh without even knowing it? Farmers. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so if you want to clip and weigh, we can look at grass production. This is actually a tool that we have on a web page. So if you Google or whatever search engine you want to use, if you search Wyoming Ranch Tools, this will be one of the first things that comes up, all right? And it's going to help you calculate your production in a pasture. Now, I will tell you that clip and weigh works pretty good in pastures that are smaller in size and very uniform in production. So they're uniform in topography, they're uniform in soil, aspect, that kind of a thing. On a 1,000-acre pasture or bigger, in the hills, it's not going to work very well. A 30 or 40-acre property that's kind of all the same, it's going to work fairly well. And what you do is, you take this hoop of a certain size, you clip all the current year's production, you dry it out. That's what this paper bag is for. You dry it out, and then you weigh it. And if you use the right size hoop, there's a real easy conversion factor to go from grams per hoop to pounds per acre. And then what this tool allows you on the Wyoming Ranch, and there's other stuff on Wyoming Ranch Tools as well. There's economic tools on there. But on this webpage, you fill in these yellow cells, and then it spits out an estimate of your grass or forage production. Okay. Again, this works very well on sort of smaller, uniform pastures. Okay. And so we have total capacity down here for 1 month. So if there's horses, 9.2. We've got goats on there to 76 goats compared. Now that's going to be a little bit different. One thing we didn't take into account there is dietary preferences. So horses and cows are very similar. Then you got sheep and then goats. They all have some overlap, but there's definitely differences in what they prefer. Okay, the other thing about forage production is using past production estimates to estimate your forage. This I can get people to do, and I want to walk you through it. I have a tool for this one too on the same webpage. Okay, but what we're going to do is, who hauls hay like this, by the way? I don't know, I couldn't stack hay like that, but when we're talking about forage production, it's important to understand the concept of AUMs. An AUM is frequently thrown around for forage production or carrying capacity. First of all, what does AUM stand for? Animal unit month. What is an animal unit month or an AUM?
How much they eat?
Okay, how much they eat. You think that's really close. It's a better answer than I normally get. An AUM is nothing more than the amount of feed that is required to feed one cow and her calf that's at her side for 1 month. Now, this was a little bit crazy because this was basically done back in the 40s and 50s when cows weighed what? Like 1,000 pounds. How many 1,000-pound cows are out there now? They passed 1,000 on their way to 1,200, 1,400, which is fine. I'm not criticizing, but it's based on a 1,000-pound cow. Now we'll convert that to a lot of other animals, but the basic 1 AUM is for 1 cow and her unweaned calf. Okay, and it's basically around 800 pounds dry weight, so air dried forage. Okay, now, depending on the kind of animal, so here's that, it's actually the second one down is the definition here. That's 1, okay? So if she doesn't have a calf, they take a little off. If we went to a bull, it's 1.35. I'd say that's probably a little low for most of our bulls. A yearling is 0.6. It's gonna be pretty close depending on the size of the yearling and where they are at the time of year. A horse is 1.25. So what this is basically saying is instead of eating 800 pounds, this horse is going to eat 800 times 1.25, okay? A sheep, we normally say, is about 1/5 of a cow, so it's 0.2. We've got the goat, even some wildlife on here. So if we're converting that, so 1 AUM is theoretically enough to feed this 1 cow, but 1 AUM is all, in theory, is also enough to feed 5 sheep, okay? Or some other conversion. All right, I'm going to skip that one. So when you're looking at calculating your production on a pasture, and it's either you don't want to do clip and weigh, or the pasture you're looking at is not well suited to do clip and weigh. These tools that we made also on the Wyoming Ranch Tools webpage does a pretty good job of helping people estimate forage production. So what we're going to do, again, these yellow cells are where you enter data. The rest is automatically generated by the tool. So here in this top one, you're going to enter the number of head grazed. So this is for historic use. So you're looking at like last year, or maybe the previous owners, or another year. We're going to enter the number of head grazed. That's, especially if you've owned it last year, it's going to be pretty easy to come up with. Average weight per head. So here we're saying a 1,200-pound cow. Number of days she was in that pasture, or they were in that pasture, 45 in this case. Acres in the pasture, 500. And then the percent utilized. Enter this as a decimal, not a percent. That's why it's 0.5 and not 50. If you enter 50, it'll go out of whack. So as a decimal. I will tell you that most livestock producers overestimate pasture utilization. Almost without a doubt. They almost always overestimate how much was utilized, okay? Even the crusty old ranchers that are 75 years old will overestimate how much they use, okay? Why is that? Especially when we're talking about grass production.
Because everything they see doesn't quite get eaten.
Okay, yeah. And then also, where's the weight in a grass plant? It's all at the bottom. It's all at the bottom. So if you have a grass that's 3 feet high and you graze it down to 1 foot high, you still might have over 50% of actual biomass still there. So almost all the weight is at the bottom. So be careful. This is maybe the tougher one to come up with, all right? So when you enter those figures, it's going to spit out how many AUMs were harvested, how many AUMs per acre, pounds consumed per acre, and total production per acre based on past use and standard animal intake rates, okay? So this is actually a pretty decent tool for estimating production, which is important if you're looking at adding. I think a couple of you said you were new, or maybe you had something going on, but you were interested in adding animals, or changing animals. Like, Lindsay, this is probably not gonna be you, but if you were gonna go from goats to sheep or goats to cows, like, this tool would be perfect for you then, okay? Or if you're looking at adding some cows or adding some sheep. Because what you can do is you can get how much pounds per acre you produced without clipping and weighing. And then you can go down to one of these other tools and start customizing it here. So these two kind of do the same thing, but from a slightly different angle. This one, you enter the total production per acre, which you got from this tool right here, 576. Then you enter how much you'd like to utilize. So let's say this is, so I maybe calling this midsummer, and I'm gonna say I'm okay with 50% utilization. If it was gonna be dormant season grazing, I might say, well, I'm okay with 75% utilization. So that might be different. Then you add the average weight per head. So again, this is probably a cow, but let's say we're gonna do a sheep. So some mature ewes, we might put 150 pounds, 160 pounds, something like that. Or if they were lambs, we'd put 80 pounds. There. And then months to graze. So this one calculates this, that you have this pasture on you have months to graze. So let's say you're leasing this pasture. The owner said, you can put whatever you want out there, but you only can have it for a month and a half, right? That's what you got. And then the acres. And then this one gives you the forage in pounds available for grazing, and then that 1 month and a 1.5 month capacity. So in this scenario, with this amount of production, you can put in 100 1,200 pound cows for a month and a half, okay? We go down here, you're not limited on time, but you're limited on number of head. So again, let's say you only have 50 cows, you're not gonna be getting any more, you just put in 50 head, according to their weight. And then it'll tell you how long in months that you can graze them. Now, I've used cows. I know I've said this, but let me stress that if you enter the weight for something else, like a sheep or a horse or bulls, I don't care. This tool will get you pretty close. It's still an estimate. But this tool is one I can get livestock producers to use, and you'd be surprised how close it'll get you. So the first one, the top one, gives you an estimate of production based on past use, and then this one allows you to figure out how many of your kind of animals you can graze for how long, and this one is based on the number of head. And then it'll give you the months, how long you can graze those. Get on there and play with it. Just make sure, again, you enter this as a decimal. Again, you're only going to be entering data into those yellow cells. But it works pretty well. There's other tools on that webpage. These grazing ones are by far the coolest ones. Don't want those economic ones on there. Okay. All right. Questions on that tool before I leave it? Yeah.
So the producers that I work with, they're held under the tyranny of the BIA.
Sure.
And they're always wanting to increase their herd.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, supposedly they're allowed to gain 5 or something like that over a period of time. But the BIA doesn't let them. And we're trying to help them produce data because the BIA isn't producing any. So we're saying, well, it's your responsibility. You produce the data and you show them, you know, that you can do this. So could they use this tool to indicate that they, if it worked out that way, that they could add some cows?
They could definitely use the tool.
Mm-hmm.
The decision, of course, is always going to be the BIA. You know, they're going to have the last say.
Well, they're all, you know, the tribes are all under these new ARMPs, which gives them a 10-year period to sort of try to drive the bus.
Okay.
But
This tool, especially for those big, well, it works pretty well anywhere, but where this tool really finds its niche for me is on those bigger rangeland environments. And so you can look at how much is being produced and then look at, you know, I have producers that are not just wanting to increase, but I work with one that totally went from a cow-calf operation to a yearling operation.
yeah,
And that's created all sorts of stuff. We use a tool like this on there, and instead of, you know, 100 cows, I'm totally making this up, but instead of 100 cows, it might be, 150 yearlings. And then there are some other ramifications. But if things are going on, in that situation, I think this tool will be useful, but I also think that some range monitoring data would be incredibly important too. And we all want to, and I have more experience with the Forest Service and BLM than I do BIA. But we always want to say, well, it's BLM's or Forest Service or BIA's job to come up with the data. Well, I agree. It probably should be their job. That doesn't mean it's always going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, who's the one that suffered? Not BIA, not the Forest Service. It's the livestock producer. So a lot of times it behooves the livestock producer to work with the agency to make sure that a rangeland monitoring program is going on. And it usually could be done cooperatively, so where the livestock producer has a big part in collecting some of that data. And that's a whole nother discussion that I would be happy to have, or to work with you guys on. But that's a whole other part of it. So the short answer is, yes, this tool will be useful in that scenario, but there's gonna be other components of that project or that plan as well. That monitoring would be a big one. So animal performance when we're grazing. So here's some cows. I didn't take this winter, but this could easily be this winter, right? When we're talking about dormant season grazing, a lot of times we're talking about plants that are, and for me this is a big part of reducing feed costs, is figuring out how to graze in the dormant season, right? Whether you're doing this for a commercial enterprise to make money on, or you have animals for fun, or for recreation, or animals that are just simply a cost, like most horses are for most people. Sorry. I own horses, so I'm not trying to bash them too much, but that's just the truth of it, right? And some people, that's how their cows are too. They just cost them money. But the dormant, when you're looking at expenses for a livestock operation, the biggest ones are feed costs in the wintertime, at least in the northern Rockies, right? So if you can cut some costs here, it's going to probably pay big dividends. All right, so what are some things we want to do to reduce feed costs? Figure out how you can feed, when you are feeding, figure out how you can feed efficiently, all right? So very little waste, with one caveat. Well, there might be more, but I'm going to talk about one for now. There are some pretty cool ways you can feed animals to improve the organic matter in the soil. But in those scenarios, you usually have to be okay with a little bit of waste, okay? So if you've got some bare spots in your pasture, if you have some places where you'd like to introduce new grasses, you can feed in those areas, increase organic matter. There's some pretty cool ways you can do that, but you have to be okay with a little bit of waste, right? Because the waste is really where your improvements are gonna come from, along with the manure and the urine that's put into the ground as well. The other thing here is testing your feeds, okay? So many people don't test their feeds, all right? So the testing feed is so easy, right? It's not even that expensive. A good extension person, so not me, but someone like Chance, can help you with it. But if you, like a haystack, you take some cores of that, you send it off to a lab, you can get one of the best tests done for $35, $40, okay? And then right? And where a lot of times feed is fed inefficiently is where we're feeding too much protein. So more than the animal can use, and when too much protein is fed and consumed, it's used as energy. And Chance can tell you more about that. But it's not an efficient way to feed, and it's an expensive way to feed, because protein is going to be your most expensive component of your feed. So if you test, there are some other good reasons to test, because it's possible to get, there's a lot of oats grown here, so you can get high nitrates. So especially with cattle or sheep, that'd be a big deal. People that sell a lot of hay sometimes will have tests, or if you're buying a lot of hay. But even the small producer can benefit from testing their feed, because it's not a big cost. It takes almost no time. The one lab that I like to work with, they send me postage paid envelopes, so you don't even have to pay the shipping, okay? Yeah, Mary,
What lab is that?
it's Ward Labs,
Okay.
yeah.
I used to work there.
Okay.
That's why I was asking.
Yeah. I try not to like, well, for one, UW doesn't have a lab.
Yeah.
We used to have a soils lab. CSU has a soils lab. There's lots of labs you can send stuff to. I try not to like advertise for more than for a lab because it's not really my job, but I just use Ward Labs a lot. I'm happy to work with producers on other labs though. And anyway, the testing is a key part of it, but also think about it in terms of how you're using your feeds. So when you're buying protein, how are you buying the protein? And I've got, I think I have a couple photos of that, and are there ways we can take advantage of feeding protein? You know, there's the lick tubs, there's just buying alfalfa hay, all those kinds of things. Think in terms of an animal performance of their requirements. So a cow that's going to be calving in February, which they're around, right, is gonna need a whole lot more feed than additional feed than a cow that's calving in May or June. I'm not saying either one is right or wrong at this point, but what I am saying is that you need to be looking at their requirements. One of the ranches I work with has cattle and sheep. Most of their cattle, you know, some of the heifers were already calving the end of February. The the cow herd is going now, sort of starting now. And they take a lot of supplement. Their sheep don't lamb until May. And I know there's differences between the species, but like those ewes, they take almost no supplements. It's just all what's growing out there because they're lambing at a different time of year where they're getting it all from what they graze and browse. So really consider animal performance because the main goal here is to feed what they need without overfeeding. And protein is probably the easiest one. I worked with a lot of guys that are feeding straight up alfalfa hay. And it's nothing to have alfalfa hay that's 20% protein. There's almost nothing on the planet that needs 20% protein, okay? Like the closest you could get to that at least that I've worked with, and I'm not in dairy production, that's a different deal, but the closest one that I've worked with on that is a ewe that has triplets. I mean, she's way up there in the mid to high teens in terms of percentage of protein that she needs. But there's a lot of alfalfa that's way higher than what's being fed, is way higher in protein than what is required. So what's the scenario there if you're feeding straight alfalfa, but you don't need it? Well, you can mix it with other lesser quality feeds, sell some, buy some lower quality feeds. Maybe that's a pain in the butt, not worth it to you. That's fine, but at least be aware of the scenario there. Okay, just a couple slides here about thinking about in terms of when you're grazing, the season of use for different grasses. I've got, this one is introduced grasses, about kind of when they're most palatable. This one is native grasses. The one I really...
back real quick, you flipped it before.
Yeah,
I
I'll take it. So did you get this one? And I'll go back to the next one. Yeah. So these are some native species in terms of, you know, when they're most palatable. A lot of times we want to extend the grazing season into the summer and then into the winter time. So what are some species to do that with? Well, like western wheatgrass is, you know, our state grass. And it's going to, you know, stay greener longer than a lot of other species. Thick spike does, you know, so these X's are kind of when they're more ideal. You notice there's not very many in the winter time. And then when we go to the introduced species, you get a little bit more, and this is one of the times where introduced species do really well. The one I like to point out here is crested wheatgrass. So a lot of people kind of cuss crested wheatgrass because it's hard to get animals to eat it, which it is, but it has some real nice properties too. It's one of the first things to come up in the spring, and it also does some nice fall regrowth. That picture I showed earlier of the fall regrowth, that was crested wheatgrass. Russian wild rye, you'll notice, has X's all the way across. Okay? The weakness here is it's really hard to get that one established.
Is that because it needs more, like moisture?
No, it's actually fairly drought hardy. It's just real kind of finicky. It just is a one that's really hard, like conditions have to be just exact to really get it to thrive. Where like crested wheatgrass, I mean, you can, well, I mean, they do it with our species too, but there's a lot of crested wheatgrass all over the country that was dropped by an airplane that grows. Well, let me go back here for a second. Oh yeah, so Basin Wild Rye. So that's that great big one that's like this big around and this tall sometimes. And you notice there's an X here, which for wintertime, the only thing I can think of the reason that there's an X there in the wintertime is because on years like this where there's a lot of snow, it's one of the only things standing up above the snow. Because other years, it is really hard to get anything else to eat that one. Same with like tall wheatgrass. So it's not always so simple and cut and dried as these charts. So the main reason I wanted to show this was that grasses, while they're similar and follow similar trends, they definitely have different strengths and weaknesses and characteristics here. So these are some of just a few natives, and then here's a few introduced ones. So like pubescent wheatgrass, these ones in here, probably the strength for me is, especially in a hay production or not even a grazing situation, is they survive droughts really, really well. But when you have a good year, they also produce really, really well. So that's kind of a nice middle ground there. They have a lot of these introduced species are easier to establish as well. Just kind of some different characters. This is Timothy. Just kind of, I got a couple slides up here looking at their nutritional content. So when we're matching a species or an animal's requirements to what's being provided here, you know, you can look at the leaf stage. This is early spring, that's the protein, compared to down here when we're getting into fall time. So, you know, especially with animals that are in a reproduction, so cows, ewes, where am I lacking their nutritional requirements and how am I best going to make it up for them?
Is there any website or tools that you could look at for kind of the species that you have to what's best to plant versus?
Yeah, there are a few. So the chart I had earlier in there, I took from a publication, and if you search engine this, it'll come right up to. It's called Dryland Pastures of Montana and Wyoming. And I know it says dryland, but it's very applicable for irrigated pastures as well. So Dryland Pastures of Montana and Wyoming. You can read it for free, print it off. It's a great publication. It's not going to have necessarily these proteins in there. The USDA, though, has a website where you can look up some species and it'll give some of these on here. The other thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking about testing your feeds is that not only can we test your feed, your harvested feeds, but we can test forage that's actually growing, okay? So during the springtime, that's especially like late spring, that's gonna be changing. It's not a constant. Once you get into wintertime, it's a lot easier to test forage because it's not really easier, it's just a more valid test because it's not changing on a daily basis. You can just tell. So like this is crested wheatgrass, one of the ones that people like to cuss. But early in the spring, I'm gonna look at these proteins, right? And then of course it's gonna go down. There are other factors in play in regards to palatability, not just protein content. Things like the cellulose and the lignin in them as well. But just kind of wanted to show those. You know, alfalfa would be, you know, you'd have that, it depends on the field and you fertilize and the age of the stand, but you know, a lot of times you'll get a first and a second, maybe a third cutting or even a grazing scenario. You know, so you'll see those steady, in fact, an increase in protein through the summer. So like you have your first cutting, which could be a very high quality of cutting, but you might have some grass in there. And then as you move into that second and third cutting, boy, that's where you're really going to start shooting those proteins up. And that's where especially like the sheep guys really want that kind of stuff. So this is a photo of a field from Hot Springs County that went from cheatgrass, so 40 acres of cheatgrass, to 40 acres of, let's see, oats, triticale, clover, and turnips, believe it or not. We grew turnips in Hot Springs County.
Did they just throw the seeds down and call it a day?
No, so there was a little bit of farming involved, yeah, and there was irrigation involved, yeah. But, so of the 40 acres, half was plowed and half was disked. And the reason for that was kind of an accident. The producer, the plow wasn't working right, so we switched to his disc. We could tell no difference in the soil, or in the production, sorry. And then it was put on it was seeded in, with a tractor. But, I mean, there's no kidding that there's like 3 to 4 tons per acre of feed there, right? And the cost for this, now I'm not gonna count his equipment cost because he already had the equipment. But he had about $700 in seed costs and $200 or $300 in fuel costs. So so we basically called it $1,000 in cost, not counting the equipment that he already had. To go from 40 acres of almost nothing to 40 acres of 3 to 4 tons per acre. And like I said, on an irrigated piece, you can do a lot of cool stuff. But this was some cool stuff. So, like, this is actually my son several years ago. He's a lot bigger now, but these are grown men. I mean, these guys are all taller than me, and you can tell where that's coming up to and on. I mean, there's a lot of feed out there, and it was really kind of a cool thing. So we talk about reduced feed costs. I had to spend a little bit of money, but this was a wonderful place to invest not very much money compared to the benefit that was received. So here's another photo of it looking down in it. That's my hat. No, I'm not underneath it in that photo. But so these are the turnips. Purple. I can't remember. So I can't want to say purple top turnips, but anyways, they were just the turnips, and it was pretty wild. Like a lot of people were like, "We're growing turnips in Hot Springs County." Yes, we did. We grew turnips, and one of the questions we got was like, "Well, do cows choke on those?" Which seems like a pretty, like, could they choke on them? And so I kind of looked into that, and it's a pretty common concern. It almost never happens. And they would eat the tops, and they would pull the turnips out of the ground, the turnip themselves out of the ground and eat them. That was pretty cool stuff.
What else was it? Oats, turnips?
Triticale, and there was some clover in there. The clover didn't do as well as the other stuff.
Is that a pretty common thing where disc versus plowing it doesn't affect their production a lot, or is it just in this specific instance?
This is the one that I'm comfortable saying it didn't. Yeah, like it was pretty much, it was totally by accident, but it was kind of a cool thing that happened. And I actually can't remember if it was the disc or the plow that was the first one, but it was almost like half the field. He's like, "Yeah, this isn't working. I'm going to go get my other one and do it." And it was just like, you couldn't even tell.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not that great of soil. Like, I mean, you guys have probably all been to Thermop. I mean, this is in those red hills. I mean, it's not right up on the red dirt, but it's right between the red hills. I mean, this is not like it was a deep, dark soil, kind of a deal.
What type of irrigation is on that land?
This is flood out of a ditch.
Okay.
I will also say that this was like 2019 or something where we had a lot of rain. So this was not I'm not trying to say that this was a dry land opportunity, it's not. But this was an irrigated field in a wet year. So that is a huge part of the production, right? I mean, it just is. But yeah, just flood irrigation out of a ditch. Okay, so the thing I wanted to say about supplements. So these cattle are on a lick tub. So one of those molasses lick tubs that's to supply protein. And the color is a little bit off here. But criticize the use of this lick tub for me and tell me why I would include it in here.
They're trampling around.
Okay, we're trampling around. Take some other clues from the photo too. These lick tubs are, I mean,
They're not eating anything else, that doesn't look like.
well, they were grazing. But the lick tub's main job is to supply protein. Does it look like we need to supply protein in this photo? I took this photo in early June. The grasses have lots of protein, right? Yeah. Okay. Also, there's another reason to criticize this photo, not so much just from a livestock nutritional requirement, but from a grazing management. What would that be?
It's focusing them all in one
Yeah.
spot.
Does the spot where this is look like a spot where a cow would want to be anyways? Well, yeah, it's flat and there's grass there. I mean, yes, and there's water nearby. For me, if I'm going to be using that lick, first of all, I wouldn't be using that lick tub that time of year. And if I was going to be using that lick tub in that location, I'd be putting that sucker way up here, right? Because that's where they don't want to be, and I guarantee you there's going to be those forages up there that have multiple years of grass growth. Okay, the other thing about watching your supplements is I really like these lick tubs for a livestock distribution tool that also provides nutrients, but they are in terms of the pounds of protein you're buying, they're an expensive way to buy protein. Okay. The nice thing about them though is you just stick them out there and the animals basically self-feed. But if you're on a small environment, these lick tubs might not be the best way to supply protein. It might be cake, it might be just alfalfa hay. A lot of the horse people I work with, I'll try to get them to dormant season graze, and then if their horses do need a little bit of protein, feed them a little bit of alfalfa. Not 30 pounds a day of alfalfa, but 5-10 pounds of alfalfa a day, because that's a cheap way to provide, or it's not cheap, it's a less expensive way to provide protein. So that's where I want guys to watch their supplements and how they're feeding them. And if you're going to use one like this, get the full advantage of using it as a livestock distribution tool. Also, there's a guy between, I don't even know the guy, I've never even worked with him, but there's a guy between Thermopolis and Worland that's feeding hay. And he's not just feeding it out where it's flat, but he's like feeding it in these draws and stuff where there's not very much vegetation. I think it's the coolest thing because he's adding organic matter, he's adding manure and urine to the side. Like, it's going to be cool to watch. And it's a steep sucker. And I've never seen him feed. I've never actually seen him out there feeding. I just see the remnants of it. So I don't even know exactly how he's doing it. But one of these days I just need to stop in there and look at it. But kind of a cool way, even if you are feeding hay every day. The other thing with your supplements is, especially with cattle and sheep, you can provide them all the protein they need for several days in one feeding. So let's say that this is totally made up, but let's say they need a pound of protein a day. You can feed them 3 pounds of protein once, and that'll give them by 3 days. Okay? So if transportation is an issue, or if you're not there, if it's a long ways away, that's a strategy as well, instead of trying to feed it to them every day. They can go several days as long as they're getting enough on a per day basis with that supplement. Okay, so this is my contact information. I'm in Thermopolis. Be happy to talk to you guys at another point in time, either on the phone or email. Chance can always get a hold of me if you know him. Chance and I work together a lot, back and forth. So, and then any other questions that you guys have about something? Well, thank you. It's good to talk to you guys, and good luck. And please feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.